In recent months, amid the constant buzz of international politics and the shadows looming over European stability, a recommendation has gone almost unnoticed by many but left clear signs for the more attentive. The governments of the European Union suggest that each citizen keep an emergency kit at home capable of sustaining their survival for at least 72 hours. The justification is simple, almost simplistic, to prepare for possible crises such as natural disasters, cyber attacks, pandemics, or armed conflicts. But since when does civilized Europe need to instruct its citizens to live as if collapse were just around the corner? What seems like an act of precaution intertwines with a new discourse of strategic resilience, promoted in conferences and official documents with a precision that borders on military calculation. It is no longer about reacting to catastrophes, but about anticipating their silent arrival. Survival manuals circulate in countries like Sweden and Finland, and even schools have begun to teach basic survival tactics. Why now? What motivated such a silent mobilization in a Europe that has always valued stability? What truth is being hidden behind the flashlights, water bottles, and iodine tablets? Welcome to another night where mysteries never sleep. I am Midnight, and this is 7 Nights. Before we begin, I'd like to ask for your help. Like the video, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It's just one click, but it makes a huge difference for YouTube to deliver the videos to more people, and for me to keep bringing this content to you. I'm counting on you. Let's get to the video. Have you ever stopped to think why, suddenly, European governments decided that every citizen should have a ready emergency kit at home? We're not talking about a country at war, nor about regions under imminent risk of natural disasters. We're talking about Europe, one of the most structured places in the world, asking each person to have flashlights, water, non-perishable food, and even iodine tablets. This list is not random. It was thought through. It hides something. Let's break it down. One of the most curious items is the portable radio. In the digital age, where everything is on the phone, why ask for a device that seems pulled from the 1980s? The official answer is simple. If the power goes out, it still works. But what this truly reveals is something else, the expectation that modern networks might fail completely. What kind of situation would cause the internet, telephony, and even emergency networks to fall into total silence? Now think about the iodine tablets. They serve only one purpose, to protect the body against radiation. They are used in nuclear accidents. There is no other reason to have them. It's not an exaggeration to say that this item alone completely changes the tone of the recommendation. If they are asking you to keep them at home, it's because they acknowledge that there is indeed the possibility of a serious radiation-related incident, be it due to a failure in a power plant or due to conflict. And cash. It seems outdated, doesn't it? But they insist on it. That's no coincidence. It's because they know that, in a real crisis scenario, digital banking systems are the first to go down. Imagine a cascading failure in the financial system, a hacker attack, or even a decision to freeze transactions. If that happened, you would depend on what you have on hand. And if everything froze tomorrow, would you be prepared? Another important point is the 72-hour self-sufficiency. 3 days. That's not a random number. That's the critical time experts consider, the interval necessary for governments to respond to a large-scale emergency. During that time, you're on your own. No one will knock on your door with help. And that's exactly why they are saying, loud and clear, prepare to be alone. Inside the kit, they also ask for copies of documents, emergency contacts, medical prescriptions. That may seem minor, but it hides something bigger. Preparations for displacement, for leaving home without prior notice, for going to a shelter or fleeing a risk area. What exactly do they expect might happen? Why this urgency now to teach us how to act in case everything collapses? And there's more. Power banks and solar chargers. Usually, power returns within a few hours after an outage. But by recommending this type of equipment, they're assuming the possibility of days in the dark. Have you ever wondered what would cause such a prolonged interruption? An energy collapse, an attack on critical infrastructures, or something deeper like a coordinated blackout? What's most intriguing is the way all this was communicated. There was no alarm, no screaming headlines. Everything was launched with an almost rehearsed calm. Well-produced videos, clear infographics, translations into all European Union languages. It was a silent action planned to look routine, but it's not. It's the kind of initiative that only happens when something serious is already being monitored behind the scenes. And this repeats across all countries: France, Sweden, Finland, Germany. Even with different contexts, the kit contents are practically identical. This indicates that the threat, whatever it may be, is not tied to a specific geography. It is transversal. It can hit a capital or a remote village with the same force. What could have such a reach? Even with so many details, no authority has mentioned a specific threat. They speak of resilience, prevention, interconnected crises. But they don't say exactly what we're supposed to protect ourselves from, as if naming it were too dangerous, as if acknowledging the risk meant admitting something that cannot be said publicly. The truth is that this kit might be more than just a set of items. It could be a message, a coded warning, conveyed in the language of precaution. They can't tell us everything, but maybe they are showing us. And if they are showing us, what exactly are they trying to prepare us to face? There is a war underway, but it's not the one the newspapers show. There are no tanks crossing borders or planes flying over cities. This war is silent, strategic, and takes place behind the scenes of diplomacy and international security. The preparedness strategy launched by the European Union in 2025 didn't come out of nowhere. It is the response to something that hasn't been publicly declared, but is felt in every recent movement by governments. The question is, what do they know that we don't? Since the gradual withdrawal of US military support to Europe, the bloc's countries have started acting more independently. Trust in traditional alliances seems to have diminished. In its place, a mentality of self-defense is growing. It's no coincidence that countries like Sweden and Finland, historically neutral, have accelerated their national security strategies, nor that Germany has restored reserves of food and strategic fuels, something not done on a large scale since the Cold War. Authorities avoid words like conflict or invasion, but their actions say otherwise. In closed sessions of the European Parliament, documents indicate increased surveillance of critical structures, dams, plants, communication and transportation networks. Cybersecurity experts have been urgently hired to reinforce public systems. And quietly, countries have begun training their populations for events that, until recently, were considered too unlikely to be taken seriously. When schools begin teaching survival and evacuation tactics, something has changed in the risk assessment. Children are learning what to do in case of blackouts, chemical or nuclear attacks. And this is not theory. These contents are already part of curricula in Sweden and Germany. This shows that political leaders no longer consider crises a possibility. They consider them a certainty. What remains unknown is when, where, and how. Another sign lies in the movements of the armed forces. Although not in direct combat, many troops have been redeployed, especially along borders with areas deemed unstable. Joint military exercises have increased, and cooperation with NATO, even among skeptical countries, has gained new strength. These actions are not taken out of mild precaution. They are coordinated responses to a perceived threat, even if unannounced. The term used by experts for this kind of tension is hybrid warfare, a conflict that doesn't limit itself to the battlefield, but infiltrates digital networks, civil infrastructure, and even public opinion. It's not about invading territories with weapons, but about paralyzing societies from within. Sabotaging energy, spreading misinformation, breaking supply chains. And when this war begins, it has no D-Day. It starts silently. It may have already started. Institutions, of course, avoid panic. But the investment in alert systems, underground command centers, and isolation protocols indicates that crisis simulations are now part of government's daily routines. Some administrative buildings have been renovated with chemical containment areas and safe rooms. All this for what? A storm? Or something they know could explode without warning. And we cannot ignore the stress tests being conducted in major cities. In 2024, Berlin and Brussels carried out secret simulations of energy collapse. For a few hours, parts of the cities were left without power or communication to measure the response time of the population and authorities. These tests were not widely publicized, but information leaked. They are preparing the public without saying what's coming. Meanwhile, mainstream media handles the topic with caution. Understandably so. Speaking openly about risks of this magnitude could cause instability. But this absence of public explanations leaves room for legitimate questions. If everything is just a precaution, why such massive investment? Why so much secrecy? The invisible war taking shape in Europe isn't on the fields. It's in the silent decisions, the confidential reports, the emergency kits handed out to families. And perhaps in this war, the greatest enemy is ignorance of what's truly at stake. What exactly needs to be hidden so carefully? Let's think together. When you hear that you should stock up on food, water, medicine, documents, and even cash at home, what's your first reaction? Fear? Concern? Maybe a feeling that something very serious is about to happen. Now imagine that same instruction being given not to one person, but to millions of citizens at once. The psychological impact is enormous. And here begins a delicate issue. Is this mass preparation really just for safety, or is there an element of control behind it? History shows that in times of crisis, governments turn to fear to organize society. It's nothing new. Wars, pandemics, catastrophes, all these situations are accompanied by awareness campaigns that often border on panic. But with the European Union's preparedness strategy, something changed. The guidance didn't arise as an immediate response to a disaster. It was launched as a preventive, structured, and detailed policy. And that completely changes the game. If there is no specific event motivating the alert, what exactly is being projected? It may sound like theory, but when you study crisis communication, it becomes clear. The more prolonged the state of alert, the more sensitive the population becomes to commands. People obey more easily when they feel there is something to fear. And when fear is carefully managed, it can be a tool of governance. It's not about saying that everything is manipulation, but it's impossible to ignore the timing of this campaign. While conflicts grow on the continent's borders, while trust in institutions fluctuates, while society faces economic and technological instabilities, a recommendation emerges that, in practice, redefines the relationship between the citizen and the state. The message is clear: you are on your own, but only as far as the government allows. Look at the details: survival classes in schools, simulations in major cities, carefully scripted institutional videos. All of this creates an environment of constant, but manageable, tension. An environment where people don't panic, but remain alert. And in this state, collective behavior changes. You think twice before protesting, questioning, or defying an official directive. This is not exactly new. Regimes throughout history have applied similar strategies, but now we have a modern version, subtler. It isn't imposed by force, but by the logic of prudence. After all, who can criticize a guideline aimed at saving lives? The problem lies in what comes with that logic. The citizen begins to accept limitations, surveillance, stricter directives, all in the name of security. And at this point, we begin to see a broader pattern. The idea of resilience is not just individual. It's being built as a collective value, almost like a new European identity. But who defines the parameters of this resilience? Who decides what it means to be prepared? In times of crisis, the lines between freedom and protection become dangerously blurred. Another important question is, what happens to those who don't follow the recommendation? Today, the kit is voluntary, but in the near future, could it become mandatory? And what if the state begins to condition access to services, travel, or benefits based on each citizen's level of preparedness? It may sound like an exaggeration, but these are paths that public policies, when misdirected, have followed at other times in history. All of this gains even more weight when we see the standardization of language. The terms are replicated in all documents, videos, official websites. The phrases are almost identical in each country: self-sufficiency, strategic resilience, culture of preparedness. These are neutral words on the surface, but when used in unison, they create a sense of forced unity, as if a single truth were being pushed with a smile. In the end, the line between preparedness and control is thin. It's not necessary to impose fear for it to work. It only needs to be nurtured calmly, with the appearance of care. And that's what makes it all so effective and so hard to question. Because who doesn't want to be safe? But in the name of safety, what else are we willing to accept? In recent years, the frequency with which we face extreme events has visibly increased. Storms that destroy entire cities, uncontrollable wildfires, droughts that disrupt supply chains. At the same time, cyber attacks on hospitals, governments, and critical infrastructure have become part of the routine. All of this is treated as a series of isolated tragedies, but are we really just dealing with chance? This is where an uncomfortable theory arises, one that has been gaining ground in serious analyses. What if some of these events are not merely consequences of climate or digital crime? What if, instead, we are witnessing a kind of programmed collapse, carefully orchestrated to test the limits of modern societies? It may seem exaggerated, but there are patterns that deserve closer attention. When a country faces a natural disaster, the government's response is usually immediate. Declare a state of emergency, apply restrictions, redirect resources, impose rules. And in times of crisis, questioning these measures is seen as irresponsible. In other words, the crisis itself creates an environment in which authority can act without resistance. Now imagine if this model were replicated intentionally. The case of cyberattacks is even more intriguing. Many are never fully solved. The perpetrators remain unknown, the methods far too sophisticated for amateurs. Hospital systems shut down, entire cities left without power, data leaks affecting millions. The response is always the same. It was an attack, we're investigating. But what if some of these attacks were allowed to happen? Or worse, simulated internally to justify increased security and new surveillance mechanisms? These scenarios are not mere suppositions. In 2021, the World Economic Forum held the Cyber Polygon event, simulating a global digital crisis with collapses in banking, energy, and healthcare. It wasn't a military exercise, it was a civilian simulation involving large corporations and financial institutions. The justification was to train for the inevitable. But what is truly being prepared in such a scenario? The response to collapse, or its implementation? It's important to observe how each recent crisis was followed by rapid structural changes. After the pandemic, we saw a forced digitalization of everyday life. With blackouts and attacks came stricter security laws. The question is not whether these changes are good or bad, but why they always occur after a moment of collective vulnerability. It's as if every social trauma becomes an opportunity to restructure the system. Another clue lies in the global narrative. There is a growing consensus on the inevitability of new crises. Governments and experts speak as if another disaster is always about to happen. This creates a state of continuous alert, where any event, no matter how small, can be amplified to justify exceptional measures. The public no longer expects stability, it expects the next shock. The danger is that, in this environment, the lines between reality and manipulation become hard to see. A flood can be natural, yes, but it can also be worsened by mismanagement or deliberate omission. A blackout can be accidental, or the result of a political decision. When the system benefits from the crisis, what prevents the crisis from being manufactured? Moreover, there's the issue of interconnectivity. Today, a failure in one country can trigger effects in dozens of others. And this makes crisis simulations even more useful and more dangerous. They don't just serve to train. They can be used to measure the impact of a controlled decision. How would the world react to a global energy failure? To an entire week without internet? To a sudden suspension of financial transactions? We're not claiming everything is manipulated, but we are saying that within chaos, there are gaps that can and are exploited. The problem is that when everything feels like an emergency, any exception becomes the rule. And whoever controls those exceptions inevitably controls the narrative. The reflection that remains is simple and unsettling. To what extent are the collapses we face the result of chance? And what if some of them are merely the beginning of something much larger, carefully rehearsed behind the scenes? Imagine for a moment opening your child's notebook and finding a lesson on how to build an emergency shelter or step-by-step instructions on how to act during a chemical attack. This isn't fiction, it's already happening. In countries like Sweden and Finland, schools are teaching survival techniques to children. The justification is noble, to prepare the next generation for extreme situations. But could this preparation reveal something deeper, and perhaps darker? This kind of content isn't new in war zones, but for the average European public, it represents a significant break. Childhood, until recently, was treated as a space of protection, a distance from major crises. What changed for institutions to now take the idea of preparation to this level? How great must the threat be to justify teaching an 8-year-old how to handle a collapse? The Swedish government, for example, launched an official manual called If Crisis or War Comes. It's distributed directly to schools and homes. It contains instructions on how to react to an invasion, how to identify signs of danger, and how to stay informed without relying on the internet. There is no panic in the tone, but there is urgency. A kind of institutional calm that reveals the alert is already part of everyday life. At the same time, the content of these manuals isn't purely technical. It carries subtle messages about self-sufficiency, obedience to government instructions, and rapid adaptation to higher orders. This creates, from an early age, a collective mindset of responding to commands. In a crisis, that saves lives. But outside of one, it shapes entire generations to follow orders without question. Doesn't that seem dangerous? Psychological preparation begins with normalization. When a child grows up hearing that blackouts, evacuations, or attacks can happen at any moment, they internalize the exception as the norm. And with that, fear stops being an occasional feeling. It becomes a permanent lens. And who defines what is an exception and what is normal, if not the authorities who shape these narratives? In the classroom, teachers are trained to introduce these topics without causing alarm. They learn to explain that it's just a precaution, that there's no need to worry. But when this repeats every year in different contexts with constant updates to the manuals, the line between precaution and anticipation begins to blur. And parents often don't even realize how deeply this discourse is being rooted. Another important point is that these instructions are being passed along in playful formats: games, colorful booklets, interactive activities. It's a smart way to teach, but also an effective way to naturalize the state of alert. When survival becomes part of the childhood curriculum, something essential about the imagination of childhood is lost. And is anyone clearly explaining that to families? We're not talking about panic. We're talking about conditioning. What is taught to children today shapes the social behavior of tomorrow. If an entire generation grows up expecting crises, it will become an adult population with a very different view of freedom, security, and authority. And that directly influences future political, economic, and social decisions. We are witnessing a silent reconfiguration of what it means to live in society. In many cases, students themselves are encouraged to teach their parents, to show how a shelter works, to organize the family's emergency kit, to review evacuation plans. This flips the traditional logic. It's no longer adults preparing children. It's children being turned into vectors of a new collective mindset. That says a lot about the direction we're heading. The big question is, why now? Why the urgent need to introduce these topics in schools on such a large scale? Are we really facing an imminent threat, or is the threat just the justification for a new form of social control, beginning at the foundation? What's being taught to today's children may be the clearest message of all. Not in words, but in structure. A silent preparation for a world that may already be transforming, and that might never return to what it once was. One of the most intriguing aspects of this new European preparedness culture lies not in what is said, but in what is carefully avoided. No leader, no European Union commissioner, no security authority has come forward to openly declare what real threat justifies all these recommendations. And yet, every measure seems calculated, every step follows a rigid logic, as if everyone were acting under instructions the public simply hasn't received. Countries like Germany and France have very different structures, yet the guidelines they follow are almost identical. That wouldn't be strange if we were talking about trade or environmental regulations. But we're talking about civil preparation for collapse. What makes countries with different climates, geographies, and histories adopt such similar protocols? Doesn't this point to a centralized directive, perhaps silently coordinated behind closed doors? And when we try to seek clearer statements, we find vague repetitions: strategic resilience, interconnected threats, autonomous security. These are terms broad enough to mean anything, and at the same time, nothing. It's the opposite of transparency. It's as if governments are authorized to prepare, but not to explain why. Who controls this silence? There are reports of classified documents being discussed in private meetings among European Council members. Some of them, according to national security journalists, deal directly with critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, hybrid threats, and undisclosed military movements. These documents are not shared with the public. They shape our daily lives, yet are decided far from the light. Even when parliamentarians try to directly question the origin of these measures, the answer is usually procedural. Preventive measure, learning from recent events, improvement of civil capabilities. But no one mentions specific events. No one details the most extreme scenarios. as if simply describing the threat were enough to open Pandora's box. Curiously, there are signs that some countries attempted to resist the standardization of these measures. Small Eastern European nations expressed concern about the rollout of widespread alarm campaigns. But soon after, all of them aligned their messaging. There was consensus, yes, but perhaps a forced consensus? And by whom? International organizations such as NATO and even the UN have maintained a distant, almost absent posture on this topic. They don't press, don't comment, don't question. This raises another possibility. What if the recommendation didn't come solely from the EU, but from an even broader coordination network? Someone may have issued warnings that never reached the press, but did reach the decision makers. The behavior of the media is also revealing. Major outlets treat the topic with extreme caution. Little is said about the depth of the measures. Coverage is punctual, limited, always with an optimistic tone. It's hard to believe there's no journalistic curiosity when entire countries are preparing as if on the brink of war. Is this self-censorship, or just a subtle way to avoid panic? In this environment, silence becomes policy, and the lack of concrete answers becomes routine. That's dangerous, because when the truth isn't spoken, it becomes fertile ground for rumors, irrational fears, and mistrust. And a population that mistrusts begins to act on instinct, not reason. That alone is already a crisis. Perhaps the most frightening thing is to consider that governments really are trying to protect us, but can't tell us from what. If that's true, then the danger is far greater than we can imagine. And if it's not, then what justifies so much precaution, so much uniformity, so much urgency in changing the way we live, teach, and think? And in this vacuum of clear information, the average citizen finds themselves between two possibilities: to trust blindly or to prepare silently. Because when silence is imposed from the top down, perhaps it's saying more than any speech ever could. In light of all this, one thing becomes clear. The preparedness being implemented in Europe is not just practical, it's symbolic. It represents a silent, yet profound shift in the way governments view the future. It's no longer about waiting for crises, but about shaping oneself around them. What began as a simple emergency kit has revealed itself as a code, a signal that the structures supporting our daily lives may be more fragile or more manipulable than we imagined. Every flashlight, every iodine tablet, every school manual is part of a narrative still being written far from public view. This story is just one piece, and one day, you may see the whole puzzle. If this made you think too, subscribe, like the video. It helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share. After all, more voices mean more discoveries.